me ask you a question that's been troubling me recently, and that is, how do you know what's even real anymore? With all of the technology and advancements that were so good for so long, now we face this crisis of sometimes looking at something and not knowing if a computer created it or if it's real. And it's never been really a problem in human history before, but with AI deepfakes and email scams, I keep getting text messages from the DMV. I mean, all of this aimed at information phishing, and you'll receive bills that are impersonation, voice impersonation. Our insurance agent was here. I mean, I know a lot of you think this is a really glamorous job, but I had to sit down with our insurance agent recently. Like, people are always like, what do pastors do during the week? I'm like, well, we visit and we pray, we prepare the message, but like sometimes we have to do really terrible, boring administrative things like sit down with our annual review with the insurance agent. And he came in and we were sitting over there in the cafe and we were going over all these like things you can cover. And he was talking about, in particular, he's like, what's the church's, what is your like information technology policy or whatever? I'm like, well, we have one. It's been in place for like a decade. And he's like, well, it probably needs to be updated because there's all these new scams going on for churches. And he mentioned one that happened here in Oklahoma where the pastor was taking a trip and he was flying and he was on the airplane. And in that period, when he got on the airplane and didn't have cell phone service, someone called the church and said, hey, I've been arrested. This is the pastor speaking. I've been arrested and I need you to wire $1,200. And the church secretary is like, okay. And so she goes to Western Union and wires $1,200 and is like furiously texting him and getting no response because he's on the plane. He lands and gets like, when you land and you get all those thousands of text messages coming in. And he's like, emergency. What? How are you? Is your arrest going well or something? He's like, what? And he calls, what? And she's like, are you out now? And he's like, out of what? I was on a plane. And she's like, oh, no. And he said how easy it is now that people get that information and use that against us. And so the thing that I see most recently is just when you're watching a video even now, it's very difficult to know if it's real or not. Now, I laugh and I mock the people that are talking about stuff on Facebook that's clearly fake, but then some of it's getting pretty good to where it's getting tougher to tell it's clearly a fake or an AI. And so now we have this problem because we're wondering and we're exhausted at what is real in our world that we can't, if it's not in front of us, what are we seeing through media that's real or not? And that's where I want to start, because I think long before deepfakes and AI, there were some struggles, and particularly before technology, there were struggles in the church with knowing kind of what were they looking at. What were the dates of when these things were going to happen was a big question they had. They wanted to know exactly how it was going to happen. And Paul writes to the Thessalonians, and he deals with some kind of similar struggles. Of course, they're not technology questions like we have, but they were dealing with kind of a lot of the similar issues. And so I want to wrestle with those questions for a few moments today. When you can't trust what you're seeing with your senses or what you don't understand, then kind of what do you do and how do you know what's real and how do you judge that? And one of the places that I learned kind of an underlying philosophy for this, if you will, kind of a high-level philosophy. And I've mentioned my training in my undergrad was in Christian philosophy and religion. And so, kind of one of those areas that I learned in the 80s to kind of help me understand and unpack some of these ideas was in an arcade in 1986. I can't move it. Go to the next one. There we go. Yeah. So this is my high-level philosophy for you today. If you don't know this is Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. Nobody ever played this? Yeah, come on, wake up. Yeah. I was trying to set you, it would have been cooler if I could have switched the slide on my own. So Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. And this game, and I don't know if you know this, they lost the licensing for Mike Tyson, and so they had to go back and make it just Super Punch-Out later. Just Punch-Out, rather. Super Punch-Out was Super NES. Anyway, so I had the real one. I had the Mike Tyson Punch-Out. It was like the only game I owned for a long time, and so I played it over and over and over and never, ever got close to beating it. But I had friends that could, and I watched them play it. And one of the things that you learned as you played these older video games is there were no saves, right? You couldn't save your progress. So if you lost, you started over at least the round that you were doing. But there were tells. There were signs. There were patterns that you watched for. And that's how you beat every game from Pac-Man to Galaga to Punch-Out. There were little patterns you were looking for. Now, this game is really old. Like I said, 1986. And guess what? 2 weeks ago, someone found a new pattern. That means this game has been played forever, since I was like 8 years old, and someone just found a new pattern. In fact, it's in one of the guys, you can probably see him. I call him the Jesus character, but he's got a beard. He's the only one on the lower left side in the crowd that has a beard there. And he bobs his head at a certain point during some rounds, and that's exactly, if you punch at that exact moment, the guy just falls down instantly. What? We missed this for like 40 years? And people are still playing this and finding that kind of stuff? But you know, if you ever wanted to win any of these games, and the guys that got really good, the guys that won like the world championships of this stuff, all they were doing is memorizing patterns. If you had a brain that could memorize patterns, you could beat those video games. It's a little different now. Most games don't really have that dynamic in them anymore. But that's what was happening. If you could memorize the patterns, you could beat the game. If you could memorize the way that the guy, blinked, or you could memorize kind of the move he did, then you would know when to attack. And you would know, conversely, when not to attack. And so that's kind of what you were looking for in those games. And the interesting thing about all of that is that you weren't set up to lose. You were set up to win. You could win. It was, will you win by noticing the patterns, by noticing what's going on around you. And I want you to hold on to that thought for a second, because Paul writes this letter to a church that's panicking about the end times, panicking about what's going to happen, panicking about the evil that's arising, panicking about new ideas that are out there. And Paul doesn't tell them a date. He doesn't say, this is when Jesus is coming back, so calendar this for yourself. What he gives them is much more powerful, because it translates even to us today. He gives them the ability to look for patterns, the ability to look for things in their world and to notice what's going on around them. And that will start to give them clues of when they're getting closer to that time. Instead of saying, here's all the answers, here's the cheat sheet, if you will, he gives them things that they can be aware of, things that they can be looking out for. And so, somebody's always saying the sky is falling. I mentioned that last week. Someone's always, I'm the new prophet, and here's how it's going to go down, and buy my book, or buy my course, or buy my system, or send me money, and I'll tell you how it's all going to go down. And that's actually one of the signs that we should be looking for, one of the patterns we should be looking for. And you don't know what to believe sometimes. Like, do you listen to the person that's freaking out, the sky is falling, or do you listen to the person that says, relax, don't worry about it, nothing's ever going to happen? And where do you kind of land in that and making your own decisions about what to believe? And that's what I think that church was struggling with. And so I want to look at 2 Thessalonians with you today. It is a rather challenging text because there's a lot going on here. But as I mentioned, 2 Thessalonians, this entire chapter, or this entire book rather, deals with pretty much as its main topic the return of Jesus and the struggle of this church and what they're dealing with and asking questions. And so as we mentioned in 1 Thessalonians, Paul kind of walked them through some of the big ideas, and here he drills down a little bit further, and I think gives them their toolbox for how they can address living in the in-between period, the period after the resurrection of Jesus, before the return of Christ. So let's look here. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 1. Now, dear brothers and sisters, let us clarify some things about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and how we will be gathered to meet him. Don't be so easily shaken or alarmed by those who say that the day of the Lord has already begun. Don't believe them. Even if they claim to have had a spiritual vision, a revelation, or a letter supposedly from us, don't be fooled by whatever they say. For that day will not come until there is a great rebellion against God and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the one who brings destruction. He will exalt himself and defy everything that people call God and every object of worship. He will even sit in the temple of God, claiming that he himself is God. So I want to pause there for just a moment because this brings up a topic that we don't hear taught on a lot, and that is this character Paul calls the man of lawlessness. Now, an interesting distinction here that scholars have brought out is this is not Satan. He's not talking about the devil here. The man of lawlessness is a particular character he has in mind. It is an antichrist, but a lowercase a antichrist likely, not the Antichrist, could be the Antichrist, but people throughout history have read this text and tried to say this is who it's talking about. It's talking about this contemporary in our society. And that's not true yet, right? Because that's not happened in the exact way that Paul has illustrated here. The scriptures tell us there will be many antichrists, many people coming either in the name of Jesus or in the name of God or kind of setting themselves up as that. So we could look throughout history, Diocletian, we could talk about Gaius, we could talk about Nero, we could talk about Napoleon, we could talk about Hitler, we could talk about any number of people, right, that have kind of set themselves up as leaders and obviously have been these kind of false prophets. They've led people astray. But this man of lawlessness is in particular set up by a pattern here that has not been exactly occurred yet in this way. One that will exalt himself and defy everything that people would call God and every object of worship and sit in the temple of God and claim that he himself is God. Now, have we had people claim to be God? Of course. There's a lot of crazy people. But not in the way that this is describing, right? Not in the way that has a big following, if you will. Most of the people that have claimed to be God have these very remote kind of cult compounds and things. And this is an incredibly different experience here in the text. This is talking about something to be watching for, but someone that basically wants to take all the credit from God for themselves and establish themselves as a God or godlike figure. And it's interesting what happens here in the next part. So check this out, verse 5. Paul's saying to the Thessalonians, don't you remember that I told you about all this when I was with you? And you know what is holding him back, for he can be revealed only when his time comes. For this lawlessness is already at work secretly, and it will remain secret until the one who is holding it back steps out of the way. So there was some question among the Thessalonians if God had already started the process of Jesus' return. And they were looking and actively looking, as we all would, right, in that immediate aftermath of Jesus, wondering when the time is coming. And so they were really looking, and people were starting to get impatient, and they were starting to say, oh, look here, this is God, this is Jesus, they were pointing out different things because they were trying to basically make it happen themselves. And so he's trying to kind of slow that down and try to say, look, that's not how this goes, and this is how it's going to happen. And he says in verse 7, for this lawlessness is already at work, right? He says it's already at work, and it's going to continue to be at work, but there are specific things we can look for. He says in verse 8, the man of lawlessness will be revealed, but the Lord Jesus will slay him with the breath of his mouth and destroy him by the splendor of his coming. So the man of lawlessness will be in charge, basically, and will seem very powerful to us. We will be in awe of his power, and just with the breath of his mouth, Jesus will defeat him. And this is the return of Jesus that he gets into. He says this man, in verse 9, will come to do the work of Satan. So it's not Satan, but he's doing the work of Satan with counterfeit power and signs and miracles. Now, this is interesting because this is not just someone that is like a business person, right, or a leader. This is someone that actually is doing things that we can't describe. We can't accurately say what they're doing. They're doing signs and miracles, but they're counterfeit power, he says. And at verse 10, he says, he will use every kind of evil deception to fool those on their way to destruction because they refuse to love and accept the truth that would save them. So God will cause them to be greatly deceived, and they will believe these lies. And then they will be condemned for enjoying evil rather than believing the truth. A lot of people struggle with verse 11. God is going to cause them to believe these lies. It's interesting. In context, it makes sense, but if you take that verse out of context, you go, ooh, that seems bad. But the reality is it's the same situation as what happened to Pharaoh in the Old Testament. The scriptures record that Pharaoh hardened his own heart against God and his people, and then God hardened his heart. The pattern is that exact pattern. Here it is the way that they have given up on the things of God. They have completely accepted this man of lawlessness, and God then basically allows them that choice. He does not force them to believe the truth. He allows them to believe their lies. And because they enjoyed that evil, rather than enjoying and living and believing in the truth, that is their condemnation. It's interesting that the choice they make is their condemnation, not God saying, I like this group of people and I don't like this group of people. It is the love of evil that condemns them. It is the love of lies and evil that condemns them, not anything directly he's doing to them. It is a choice they've made for themselves. And that's where we find something interesting here. Paul's establishing that this is not a mathematical rhythm or a riddle to solve. They don't need to go searching for this. What they need to understand is there's a pattern to look at. Not unlike a video game, here's what to look for. Paul teaches these things, that they will rise to power. And so we can look throughout history. We're real smart. We're very bad at this in real time, but we're very good at this looking back in history. So we can look at the Caesars, right? We can look at the dictators of the 20th century. We can look at people that rose to power, that used political systems to oppress people. Every time a human being or a human system says, trust me, don't trust God, trust me instead of God, I'll fix everything, I'll make it all better. That's the pattern, that's the tell, that's the rhythm we're looking for to identify. And as long as we plug ourselves into that system and ignore the signs, ignore the clear tell, then we're starting down the path away from God and picking evil instead of God's truth. And when we do that, that's exactly what he's trying to tell the Thessalonians. He doesn't want to scare them, but he does want them to recognize that the return of Christ is coming. They don't have a calendar. They can't set a date and a time for that, and he can't do that for them. But here's how to settle it. The noise you're hearing now, the panic you're hearing now, the, hey, here he is, here's Jesus, here's God, he's done, all this stuff, all the people trying to ascend to God's throne and become God themselves, none of that will survive. But instead, God remains sovereign over all, and God will come back on his own timeline. So what you do in that time being is wait. And that's difficult. That's a lot more difficult than having all the answers. It's a lot more difficult than being able to say, I know the date, I know the time. Like I mentioned last week, I love a calendar, I love a spreadsheet, and so I love having things and knowing when they're going to happen, and that's just not a gift that we get about this particular thing. But instead, we put our trust in God for that part. That's what faith is. It's putting our trust in God that he is king and that he is in charge of a kingdom that we can't fully even understand yet, in a way that we can't completely comprehend. N.T. Wright says it this way. He says, God remains sovereign over all. And one day, he will put all wrongs to rights and bring all human empires under the rule and judgment of his own saving kingdom. Wright continues, in particular, God will judge during history and finally at the end of history itself the imperial systems that have put themselves in his place. Think about how many earthly governments have been created that have tried to completely subvert the idea of God even. They've set themselves up as God for the people. There is no need for religion. You have us. And probably the hermit kingdom is one of the clearest examples in contemporary time of this, and that is of North Korea, commonly called the hermit kingdom, where they have tried to all but eliminate all religions and make the state, which they call a philosophy, but if you study it very close, Juki philosophy seems very much like a religion or a cult. It is a cult of personality, is it a cult of their leader, who they have all these crazy theories about, that he's not human, that he ascended from a mountain, and he's special in some way, he's the best athlete in the world, and you're just like, Kim Jong-un is the best athlete in the world? Dude ate too much cheese and his ankles swelled once. What are you talking about? But this is the theory, right? I mean, they have all kinds of crazy theories, and it's funny for us because we're not under that, but we have to realize that the folks in North Korea are humans just like us. We're not any better than them, and we are just as susceptible to them, to falling under the trance of modern kingdoms that are not the kingdom of God. And so we have to be on guard for that. And we have to be aware when anyone tries to ascend to that level. Clearly in North Korea, the Kim dynasty has ascended to that level. They have kicked God off the throne and tried to climb into his chair. we are just the same kind of humans as exist in North Korea. And so we have to be very aware and watch, like Paul said, watch for those signs of anyone trying to do that. And when they do that, we have to not accept that and be a part of that illusion. And this is where we can feel kind of the weight lifting off our shoulders. If we have been worried about the end of time, if we've been worried about our own life or our own country or our own world affairs, we are free in a certain way of that because we are not we're not citizens of this kingdom. We are citizens of an eternal home and an eternal kingdom that goes beyond this place. And so if you feel like you've been trying to figure out all those details, or you wouldn't be, you got to figure out how to be good enough to make it by the cut or something like that, you can stop that. The patterns all point us to something that Easter talked about explicitly, and that's that Jesus already won. He's the victor of this. And so the battle has been won. You don't have a battle to win. You are not a warrior being asked to fight some kind of war. The idea actually is silly in the face of the fact that Jesus laid down his life on the cross for us and won the final victory over death itself. What more do we have to fear? Easter has already happened. The tomb was empty. The spoiler is we know how the story ends. Your job is not to figure it out. Your job is to trust the one who finished it. Your job is to trust in the one who finished the ultimate battle for you already. And so at the end of the day, you can rest like the king has already won because he did. This is all past tense for us. When I mentioned we're in the in-between time, we are past tense in the battle being won. We are in the middle period before we are pre-return of Jesus. And that's where we are in this middle period. We have work to do. We have good things to be a part of, but we are not waging some war or figuring it out for God as if he needs us to figure that out. He has accomplished this. And God himself, when he built the universe, did it in a rhythm to establish for all of creation the 6-in-1 rhythm, the work of 6 and the rest of 1, the 7th, is an idea of striving and then stopping, working hard and then resting. And it is the oldest pattern in the Bible itself. And so God himself established this pattern for us to give us a future and a hope. And so that's what I would hope to do today, is to convince you to take that, would you go to that next slide, the Sabbath rest? Maybe. Will it go? Yeah, Sabbath. Stop, rest, worship. And what this does for us, and that's what I love about this, because like if you work 7 days a week, then you are completely dedicated to the work and you think it all falls on your shoulders. But if you can disconnect for at least 1 day a week, it puts you in a better pattern of understanding that the world doesn't fall apart just because you rest. Chick-fil-A has made a great business, and they still rest 1 day a week. None of the others have figured that out, right? And I know some of you now are thinking chicken, and I'm not going to get you back on track for the rest of this service. But Sabbath, to rest, to stop, what that helps do is a reset that we desperately need on a regular basis, to reset ourselves and to say, there is a God, I am not God. The person proposing to me that they are God is not God. And I can put my trust in God. And that's ultimately, once again, the definition of faith itself. So choose Sabbath, because it's like a dress rehearsal for what comes when Jesus returns. Every Sabbath, you're kind of acting out the end of the story, that the work is finished. There's nothing else to do. The king has come. The striving is over. You are now to rest in his perfect kingdom. When this new earth and this new heaven come into existence, something that we can barely even imagine how beautiful and glorious would be. And so that's what we're doing right now. In this hour we spend together, where we do things that you don't do all week long, probably. Sing corporately. Pray corporately. Read the scriptures corporately. Together, do this in this space. We sang, we gathered, we sat down, we stopped for a minute. We put a pause on the week. And when we do that, what we're doing is rehearsing the finish line that I mentioned last week. I mentioned last week a lot of our job is like on the Memorial Marathon, we are the guides on the marathon. The people are running through life, and we're to point the way to the finish line. Jesus is ahead. Don't take this detour. Keep heading towards the finish line. But when we practice this together in Sabbath, what we're really doing is we're rehearsing what that's going to look like together. And the invitation is to take this rhythm and let that rhythm become a part of your entire existence, resting like the King has already won, because he did.